Welcome back, Honors. Up on it, right? We are getting very, very close to your very, very first test, which is going to be on Monday. And of course, like I said, big thing to remember, we are going to review a little bit before we take your test, just so we can make sure that all these concepts are drilled down and stuff like that. But also, just to give you a heads up, the Persian Empire is the empire that we kind of talk the least about. So it's the one you need, if you're focusing on the rest of the empires, like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Phoenicia, Hebrews definitely need to go back and study them because like they were a very, very big flip. Hebrews, and then who else came after the Hebrews? Then the Assyrians, and then the Persians. Big things that are really important to remember is that the Persians are the one that we go into the least amount of depth with, just because they also arrive in our next unit, right? When we talk about the ancient Greeks, they will pop up there because of some of the wars that they have with them, right? So we ended up getting into Cyrus the Great, the Persian concept of tolerance, the Persepolis, like the massive city known as Persepolis in Iran that was built by the ancient Persians, right? The limited amount of stuff that's actually left behind, and we'll talk about the guy that's responsible for the reason why there's limited stuff left behind, or it's only ruins left of Persepolis, which is a big issue. Now, getting into it, though, there were, like, in Persepolis, 36 giant columns, all topped with these bowl-like structured tops, right? And giant reliefs on the walls symbolizing Persian guards known as immortals. Immortals were the best military unit inside of the Persian Empire. Every time the Persians would take over a certain area, they would take the best parts of their military and usurp it into theirs, creating this legion of guards that would protect the city and the king of Persia through very, very intense military strategy and also military training. And so they were known as immortals, right? And there were upwards of 10,000 immortals that actually protected the city of Persepolis and its ruler. And there were these huge ramps that led up into Persepolis, especially in the Apadana, which is the audience hall. They're huge ones that led up into the hall, allowing people to ride in on a chariot, right? And to give you some like further understanding of Persepolis, Persepolis was ruled by multiple different figures, but the big three figures that ruled through Persepolis were the following. 1, Cyrus the Great. 2, Darius the First, right, who is going to be followed by his son, Xerxes, right? Xerxes rules like a dictator, though, from Persepolis. Xerxes, out of the very first three key influential leaders of Persia, he's going to start to be like kind of this weaker downward trend of rulers, all right? Because he kind of doesn't begin to adopt that tolerance idea. He begins to kind of try and suppress rebellions and things like that. But it is important to know that out of all of Persia, we are talking about three key rulers. And we'll get more in depth with them at the end of this presentation. At the very, very end, we go into a little bit more case-by-case basis of each particular ruler, right? But going further, right, we're going to keep getting into it. That right there, that is the Apadana, right? That was what we believe the audience hall itself looked like when you rolled into Persia to meet or greet their king and actually talk to the royals. You would go to this place, and as you can see, here are the pillars with all of their bowl-shaped tops. 60 feet tall, made completely out of marble, an amazing architectural achievement. And this actually is the side of one of the ramps on the Apadana, showing kind of a little bit of that Assyrian-style art. Because you do need to understand that when the Persians continue to take these people over, they are now adopting certain elements of their culture, right? And that is known as cultural diffusion. That spread of cultural traits through war and trade, right? Now, to keep going with it, of course, that's the immortal release. And then to keep going, there we go. I hate this Prezi so much. I need to throw it out and make a brand new one. I don't know why it's so awful, but it is. It literally looks like a glamorized PowerPoint, and I don't know if you could tell how much I hated it in class today, but man, this thing is terrible. But anyway, it's okay because it does have some good content in it, though, right? So important things to know, like we talked about with all of our ancient empires. We talked about their government, we talked about their military, we talked about their art, and now we're talking about their religion, right? So the Persian religion was this thing known as Zoroastrianism, right? Started by this man, Zoroaster, right? Zoroastrianism was kind of like the very first large base monotheistic religious structure. Now, interestingly enough, it has very intense parallels to the Christian faith as well, right? They were monotheistic. They believed in one God known as Ahura Mazda, right? And Ahura Mazda is the all-knowing, all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent, much like Yahweh, much like God in the Christian faith as well, this all-knowing, all-powerful, very, very all-good force God. But they also believed and a negative force. Now, he wasn't necessarily a god. He was much more like a deity, kind of like Satan in the Christian faith. We wouldn't really refer to Satan as a god, but he has a name in the Zoroastrian faith, and he's known as Ahriman, right? And Ahriman is this big bat-winged force of evil. And a lot of people, actually some people believe that some of the earliest writings of Satan being this ruling force, much more like in the lines of John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. We believe that culturally diffused over time, that this is the birth of that benevolent evil leader of like an underworld kind of perspective. More than likely, Ahriman was actually blended with Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, and that kind of began to create a lot of the early Christian symbols of Satan, as well as being like a intense force. Because a lot of early Christians actually, especially in the Italian Renaissance, do not believe Satan was like a ruler of hell. It's actually much more that he was like a person being punished in hell, especially according to Dante, which we'll talk about later on in the unit when we talk about the Renaissance, right? But the big thing with Zoroastrianism, again, started by Zoroaster, was a monotheistic faith. So it was quite different from the other faiths that had existed throughout the rest of these empires. Egyptians, very polytheistic. Mesopotamians, extremely polytheistic. They had over 3,600 gods, right? Phoenicians, polytheistic. Greeks, polytheistic. Assyrians, polytheistic. All of them having tons of different gods, deities, and different religious practices. In the Zoroastrian faith, they believed that good people went to a plane much like heaven, and that the bad went to a plane much like hell, right? They didn't call them these things, but there was a paradise and then a punishment as well. Now, it is actually still practiced today, and it is believed, like I said, to have influenced Christianity and other religions early on, right? So now, anyway, but that was their faith, right? As Cyrus the Great rose to power and as Darius rose to power, that is how they actually molded and modeled and faith that was based in a one-God monotheistic system, right? So now the big question is, though, is like we've talked about really quick, like De La Cour in class today was like, man, look, good Lord, that is a huge amount of territory, right? Like if they started out right here and they expanded to a continental area that is bigger than the continental United States, then how the heck do you rule something this large? How could you ever rule something that big? Well, a lot of it has to do with how they're going to divide up the empire, right? So Cyrus and Darius kept control of this massive empire. Cyrus, of course, being Cyrus the Great, and then Darius coming after him, kept the control of this massive empire mainly, by breaking it down into provinces, right? So much like Djoser in ancient Egypt, creating the nome system, what Cyrus and Darius did is they chopped the Persian Empire up into separate provinces. And every province would be led by a governor, usually known as a satrap, right? Or a satrap. Now, the satrap is going to be loyal to the emperor or the Persian king and is going to be the force of control in that individual province, right? So the Hebrew area outside of Jerusalem had a satrap that was loyal to the Persian leader, right? The area over next to Troy, or modern-day Troy towards Turkey, had a satrap, right? So, like, they all had these governors that were loyal to the leaders, okay? And actually, right here, you can see a satrap art relief, again, in that kind of Assyrian-style art, right? Actually seeing him being paid royalties by some of the leaders of the communities that they had taken over, right? So remember, though, tolerance, they were allowed to practice their ideas, allowed to practice their faith, allowed to keep their culture. They just had to pledge loyalty and pay their taxes through the satraps, who would then funnel the money back to the leaders of Persia back in Persepolis, right? Also, really interesting thing is some of y'all are still saying, like, no matter what, like, I'm sure, like, Layla's, like, kicking back and it's like, well, you know, no matter what, people are going to want to rebel at some point or another. There's no way you have an empire this big and you're not going to have some sort of rebellion. And you know what, Layla? You would be right, actually. Layla is, like, spot on the money. So what the Persians do to snuff out rebellions early is they actually had royal spies, right? They had spies that would be inside of every single province that would spy on citizens, listen to the talk that's going on in marketplaces, and would actually report to the governors to make sure that no revolts or nothing was going to pop up that the Persian Empire would then have to deal with, right? One very famous, very, very famous revolt that occurred in the Persian Empire was known as the Ionian Revolt. And what I need you to do really quick is jot down Ionian Revolt. And in the Ionian Revolt, the Persians realized that the Athenians over in Greece were giving money and funds and weapons to the Ionians to have a revolt. And the spies of the Persian Empire were the ones that figured that out and then reported it back to Darius himself. So like I said, we are going to talk about these guys again a little bit later on, right? Now, the other really intense thing, though, is kind of like this super, super intense infrastructure road system that ran through the entire Persian Empire, right? It was known as the Royal Road. Predates the Silk Road, which is very important to understand. Predates that by several hundred years and is 1,677 miles long. And some of you are like, well, I heard that the Silk Road is like 3,000 miles long. And you are right. The Silk Road was a longer route. However, the Royal Road for its time was still a very, very intricate trade system that ran through the entire empire, spreading cultural diffusion left and right, and actually acting as a conduit for the spread of cultural identity throughout the Persian Empire, right? Being over 1,677 miles long, though, and it had 111 relay stations, or like rest stops, right? They had small roads that branched off the Royal Road so you could get to other major cities, but they had relay stations that had rest areas, places you could sleep, places you could go to the bathroom, and fresh horses as well to trade out so you could then keep pushing your goods along the Royal Road. It served as an early postal system as well, and this entire Royal Road could be traveled in about a week by a horseman, right? It was very, very efficient, and actually you would even see massive caravans traveling over the Royal Road as well, which could take anywhere upwards of a month, right? Mainly just due to the fact that a caravan moves much slower than an individual horseman who's going to these relay stations and swapping horses back out, right? So as you can see right here, that is the Royal Road itself that actually ran all the way through the western edge of the Persian Empire, carrying goods, carrying wares, and then as it expanded even over into the Eastern Empire, and then actually brought silks and porcelains and spices from India throughout the entire Persian Empire, right? So the Persians do not get enough credit. They really do not get enough credit for being a sophisticated, well-infrastructured, peaceful kind of empire, right? Because they were able to take over this massive area, and a lot of it has to do with their positive leaders, right? Cyrus the Great and Darius the First, right? Darius the First being imaged here, that is one of the relief structures of Darius himself. Darius the First, though, big origin story, is super intense. And oftentimes he is also referred to as Darius the Great, right? Now, he is a member of the king's bodyguard, right? So Darius the Great, or Darius the First, has a very interesting story. You have to understand, in 522 BC, historians believe that Darius the First, the former bodyguard of the Persian leader Cyrus the Great, overthrew and assassinated the king who is believed to be Cyrus's son. So some of you are saying, why is a guy great if he's murdering Cyrus's child, who probably would have been a good leader as well because he was raised by his father, right? Well, the interesting part about it is apparently during the coronation ceremony of this new leader who was Cyrus's one and only son, and because Cyrus had a bunch of daughters and one son, and this son took the throne, and in 522 BC, Darius arrived in the royal hall in the Apadana in Persepolis and pointed to the man on the throne and said, "That's not the king. That is not Cyrus's son. That is an imposter. He is faking it, and he is dressed up in his clothes, and he runs up to him, and he slays and kills this imposter, right? And then he goes off, and he marries Cyrus's daughter and effectively becomes king of Persia, right? So this is an interesting moment because is it a possibility that he just assassinated the king so he could have power of his own? Probably, right? It's much more than likely. But the story actually transferred throughout the entire Persian Empire, and you can actually see Darius slaying not Darius Rucker, Darius slaying the imposter. All right, so all right, Darius the Great, there he is right there. Not Darius Slay, that's a cornerback for the Eagles. Yes, go Birds. And where is he at? Oh, there it is right there. This relief, which is actually on the walls of one of the Apadana structures inside the Persian halls, you can actually see him with there he is, slaying Daria, or Gatma, the guy that is supposed to be this fake Persian king, right? He's being trampled upon by Darius, and his foot is on his chest, and it's supposed to be a very historical moment throughout the Persian Empire, right? So now, ironically enough, like we said, all things considered, most historians believe he might have just killed Cyrus's child, but like still, he does take power, and he creates a very efficient, well-organized government, dividing the area up into province, appointing the satraps. He's going to bring peace and stability to the entire area, and he's going to even expand the empire 500 miles. One thing about Darius, though, is he is going to be the one responsible for like trying to start a war with the Greeks to bring them into the empire as well, but unfortunately he fails at this once with an invasion after he crushes that Ionian revolt we talked about last time. Another interesting thing, though, too, is to Western civilizations, after trading with the Greeks, he is the first one to introduce a money-based economy. Darius I is the very first guy to actually create money with his symbol on top of it that you could like pay for things with precious metals in a certain weight amount of gold, silver, and or other precious metals like iron, right? And so he introduced the concept of using money to pay for things instead of a barter-based economy, right? And then you had his son, Xerxes, right? Xerxes, Xerxes, not Xerxes, which happens every single year, and it's okay. But Xerxes, Hollywood paints him like this. Hollywood tells you that he looks like that. That movie 300 that I was talking about in class today, they like image Xerxes like this. This really creepy, benevolent, scary ruler who wore gold all the time and thought he was a god. Well, he did think he was a god. This is what he actually looked like, right? So Xerxes was not as positive of a ruler as Darius I was. He is the son of Darius the Great, and yes, he technically brought Persia to its absolute height expansion-wise, but he is best known for his invasion of Greece during what's known as the Third Persian War, right? The leaders following Xerxes are going to be massively weak and cause disunity among the empire because Xerxes himself ruled much more like a dictator than he ever actually ruled like a positive leader like his father, right? Xerxes apparently also was into like mysticism and was into some very strange ideas about gods and faiths. And like, for example, he believed in Zoroastrianism, but not fully. Like at one point he told a bunch of men to go out into the water and whip the water. So what ended up happening is, just to give you an influence into Xerxes' mind, Xerxes tried to build a land bridge, tried to build a bridge that would bridge a very long strait between Persia and Greece, so his army could walk over the bridge and then go invade Greece by land. And what happened is the river flooded, and it ended up knocking out the bridge in this like strait area. And he got really mad. He was like, "Oh, the gods of water are trying to take my bridge away." And his lieutenants come up to him. They're like, "Well, we can rebuild it again. It's not that big of a deal." And Xerxes says, "No! Punish that river and punish those deities. Take these whips and go and whip the water." So Xerxes is a little bit of an odd breed, right? They did end up rebuilding the bridge and invading Greece by land also anyway. But the big thing about it is you got to kind of understand his mindset a little bit. But it didn't really matter in the long run because every single leader that followed Xerxes, which Darius and Xerxes, again, will both come up later, again, in the next unit, and they're just matching areas in the test, so just make sure you know who they are. You definitely need to know the difference between Cyrus, Xerxes, and Darius, right? But you also need to know this guy, Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great was a Greek. He was not actually a Persian leader. But the reason why he's so important is he's the Macedonian king that laid the final death blow to the Persian Empire and conquered it, right? Now, when I say the death blow, he conquers the Persian Empire. The Persians do pop up again later during the European Middle Ages when they actually adopt Islam and they convert to what's known as, I think they converted to Shiite Islam. But the big thing about it is the Persian Empire was fractured and crumbling following the era of Xerxes, right? Following his rule, all the leaders that came after him were very, very weak. And like we talked about in class, if you have a weak ruler, you have a weak empire, right? And so as it was collapsing, here comes Alexander the Great at the age of, I think it was like 20, like in his 20s, and he sets his sights on Persia, and he goes all the way into Persia, chasing after another ruler of Persia known as Darius III, and he ends up actually taking over the entire Persian Empire. So that's kind of the fall of the Persian Empire, is when Alexander the Great showed up and conquered it. And this was where Greece was. It was right on the edge of the Persian Empire that we talked about, right? And then this right here is showing that in November of 333, Alexander the Great and his trusted general Parmenion defeated the Persian king Darius III at Codomanis, right? And on this uneven coastal plain, which was south of this place called Issus, right? So his campaign through Persia is the thing that leads to its fall, right? So that is the rest of, I think that is it, right? Is that it? Yep, that's it. Okay, so, and that is the rest of this Persia presentation, right? Remember, not heavily tested on. Just use your study guide to study this stuff. You will be fine. We will review it in class as well before we start our test, and I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good one. Study hard this weekend. You're going to do great.